As I said, tonight we move on into chapters 20 and 21. And let me give you a heads up. I've been promoting, I guess, since we started, that my intention was for us to finish the book of Genesis by the end of June. And as I was laying some things out, I began to realize we're going to have to cover so much ground to effectively achieve that I'm not sure that we will allow for the proper reflection upon some of what's described. And so I'm going to call an audible. If you'll allow, my intention is to, through the remainder of June or to the end of June, we're going to get all the way up to the story of Joseph. And then we'll take what traditionally for us is a break in July. And then, Lord willing, first Wednesday in August, we will come back to Genesis. But for the remainder of that study, we're going to center in on that rather significant person by the name of Joseph. So if you allow that slight adjustment, it will permit us, I think, to approach some of the material in the coming weeks in a way that I think permits us to really center in on some of the lessons. And we're going to cover 2 chapters tonight that won't be uncommon, but we still have quite a few chapters ahead, so I wanted to make you aware of that. But as we move into chapters 20 and 21, I've entitled tonight's lesson, excuse me, The Everlasting God That's never fun. The everlasting God is faithful. My prayer is tonight, this is going to be an encouraging lesson to you. But if you've been with us, you know, as we have centered our attention on the experiences of the man Abram, later to be renamed Abraham, what we've done is we've attempted to learn about the life of faith. Because it's the Apostle Paul that would characterize him to be the father of those who believe, the father of faith. And so it makes sense as we are surveying the book of Genesis that we might look at his experiences and ask the question, what does that teach us about the life of faith? And as you have participated, I've tried to keep in front of us some basic lessons about faith in a way that I hope is beneficial. And even tonight, I've incorporated some of those earlier statements into our handout. I think it was last year I came across someone that was talking about the role of a pastor or a teacher or a preacher. And the point that was made was that our role isn't so much to constantly roll out things to you that are new. Rather, our task, more times than not, is to remind you of what you should already know. And I say that only to emphasize tonight, I want to keep bringing in front of you aspects of the life of faith that you should already know, but frequently we just need to keep hearing it so that we allow what we recognize to be true to be more characteristic of our life. And so what are these lessons? Well, if you have the handout in front of you, and if you're watching online, you should be able to find a link where you can download this evening's outline. You will find that to be beneficial as we move through this evening's material. But on the handout, let me just refresh our memory of where we've been. What is the life of faith? Well, let me start by, again, acknowledging the life of faith is not about a feeling. When we emphasize having faith, we are not suggesting that you're supposed to have a particular type of feeling. Now, I'm not going to deny when faith is active, it does affect our emotions, but that's not biblical faith. What is it? Well, biblical faith is a response to God and His Word that then determines the course of your life. That's faith. You're responding to who God is, what God says, and because of your trust in who He is and what He says, that impacts you. It affects the direction that you're moving. It impacts who you are becoming. That is the life of faith. Now, I state, as I have in previous weeks, faith that does not influence how you live is not faith at all. One more time, what does the writer of James say? Faith without works is dead, with the implication it's not faith. When faith is present, you're responding to who God is, what God says, and that influences who you are. Now, as I would stress that, I quickly would then add the life of faith will include both obedience and failure, clarity and struggle. There's no one in this room, there's no one that's watching online that would have the audacity to suggest that if you have faith, that you never stumble. That's not true. Men and women of faith will find, because of God's work in them, the ability to obey, but they will also stumble. And we've seen that illustrated in the life of Abraham. No, it's not characterized by perfection. No, the mark of real faith is not that you never fail, but that you return to God when you do. That when you stumble at some point in your life of faith, you redirect your heart to a God who loves you, seeking appropriately forgiveness as needed, and He lifts us up and then enables us to do what? Walk with Him further. Resume the walk. Continue to experience the change of life. The final statement on the handout I would add is this: faith, if you think about it, learns to trust God's promise, wait on God's timing, and rest in God's faithfulness. That's the life of faith. Now, I've included in the handout an additional statement beneath that list, and listen to what it suggests. The life of faith is sustained not by human perfection. It's not dependent on your achievement or accomplishment, but by the faithfulness of the everlasting God. As I noted, tonight's lesson I've entitled, "The Everlasting God is Faithful." Why am I using that phrase? Well, as we move through chapters 20 and 21, as you come to the end of the 21st chapter, we find Abraham again responding to the Lord, calling on the Lord. In fact, the verse is in the handout. Let me read it for you. Genesis 21:33, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. Now, why does Abraham refer to the Lord as El Olam? And incidentally, this is the only place in Genesis where that description of God is found. Why here? Why now? I would suggest to us, in part, what's being emphasized by Abraham by characterizing God in that way is that he understands in a fresh way who God is. That He's a God of the past, He's a God of the present, He is the God of the future. He is the everlasting God. And as we will observe through the experiences in chapters 20, 21, though Abraham will experience high points and low points, we'll again observe Abraham struggling with fear, stumbling in a way that he should not, and even bringing the promise of the child that God has pledged into threatening that promise. What does he discover? In the midst of all of that, God is faithful. And who is that God? He's the everlasting God. He's the God who's faithful in the past, faithful in the present, faithful in the future. For all of time, we can truthfully say of the Lord, He's faithful. Now, with that as an introduction, I direct your attention to the 20th chapter. If you were with us last week, obviously, chapter 19 is not an uplifting chapter. God judges Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a horrific scene. The devastation would cause any heart to tremble. And we're told as we move into chapter 20 that Abraham leaves where he was dwelling. Now, I'm going to speculate. It doesn't describe it in the text, but I want you to think with me about it. Remember when the three visitors approached Abraham, informing him of what he was going to do, and wherever they were, you get the impression that he could see on the horizon where Sodom and Gomorrah was located. He knew what was being discussed. It's not outside the possibility that as God judged in the way that he did, that at that great distance, Abraham could see the effects of it, the devastation. And what would you do? I don't know that I would stay where I was. I might get up and say, I think we need to move a little bit further away from this place. And again, whatever was the motivation, that's what chapter 20 describes. What I'd like to do is read the totality of the 20th chapter, and I know it's a long read, didn't have room in the handout to provide it, but I want you to listen to the scene because it will give us some perspective on Abraham and what God is doing. I'll begin the reading with verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. And he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, she is my sister. And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man, because the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife, with the implication Abraham's wife. Now Abimelech had not approached her, so he said, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he's my brother. And in the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called on his servants, told them all things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you see that you did this thing? Abraham said, I did it because I thought there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he's my brother. Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen, male servants, female servants, gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. So to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is a sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech. And he also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. I entitled this first section, Fear Should Not Be Our Guide. Now, remember my initial question to start? Is there a chapter in your life you wish you could forget? I would argue this is probably the chapter Abraham wishes he could forget. This is an episode in his life, perhaps years later, he would look back on and say, what was I thinking? What was I doing? The problem, as you look closely at it, was Abraham was afraid. And he was allowing his fear to serve as his guide to determine his actions. Now look one more time back to verses 1 and 2 as that's introduced. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. As I interjected, from my perspective, I think he left where he was because he was afraid. He thought, I needed to leave the area of Sodom. I need to get out of there. And he now finds him in Gerar, and fear is beginning to again take hold of him. So much so that he says to Sarah, as they entered into this area, be sure and tell people, you're my sister. Tell them you're my sister. And because of that, as verse 2 indicates, Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. Now, if you've been with us, we've seen this before. And back in Egypt, 25 years earlier, this is exactly what Abram at the time asked Sarai to do. Don't say you're my wife. They're going to kill me. And here he is, age 99, having spent this extended period of time, you would assume, learning to trust in God, learning to walk in the light of God's promises. Suddenly, he begins to react in ways that reflected his former self. And what's driving that? Fear. In fact, if I may, if you look at the handout, let me make some observations about the impact of fear. First, if you think about it, fear distorts our perspective. In verse 11, consider what Abraham said to Abimelech, trying to justify his deceit. I thought there is no fear of God in all this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. What does fear do to the heart, to the mind? Well, it causes Abraham to assume the worst. It causes his vision to narrow. It magnifies, at least in his mind, in his paranoia, danger. It clouds his judgment. I wonder, how many times does fear produce that effect in you? I mean, as you have experienced life, have you heard a voice whispering in the back of your mind, God will not provide for you. This situation is hopeless. You must take control. You need to protect yourself. Something was going on within Abraham's mind that's causing his perspective to be distorted. And it was fear. It was the driving source. But still further, as you think about its impact, fear, based on the example of Abraham, drives compromise. Abraham deliberately deceives Abimelech. I mean, let's not soften it. Yes, Sarah technically was his half-sister. We discussed that back in the episode in Egypt. But what Abraham is doing here is he's using partial truth to create a deliberate deception. That's a lie. Derek Kidner, in his commentary on this, wrote, "Half-truths are whole lies when they're designed to mislead." That's precisely what Abraham is attempting to do. And that's what fear pushes individuals to do. It pushes them toward compromise. Again, think about it in your own life experiences. Fear, when it's manifest, sometimes pushes us to compromise our convictions. It pushes us to compromise our integrity. It pushes us to compromise an area of obedience or an area of purity or truthfulness. See, when we allow fear to settle into our mind, to become that dominating influence, it will inevitably lead us astray. Think of it this way. Fear is a poor shepherd. You don't want fear to be the one guiding you along the path. Yet, with Abraham, it's fear that's shaping his approach. And one other observation, fear forgets God's promises. That's what happens. And in a way, this may be the most astonishing part of this. Last week with Dr. Massey, you were in chapter 18. And what did God say in chapter 18? Within a year, Sarah's going to have this child I've been promising you for 25 years. You're on the verge of the promise being fulfilled. That's the promise. But now he's in this area of Gerar and Abimelech. He's afraid that Abimelech's going to kill him. And so what does he do? He denies that Sarah's his wife, so Abimelech claims her. Think that through. He's putting God's promise in jeopardy. How is she going to conceive the promised child if she's living in the harem of Abimelech? How's that going to work? But see, that's what fear does. It causes you to forget what God said, to ignore the promises that God has placed before you, so that you're now making decisions, not based upon promise, but based upon fear. And because of Abraham's fear, returning to the outline, Abimelech takes Sarah. Now, just as an aside, if I may, Sarah's 90 years old, as you think about it. From my perspective, I doubt that she was primarily taken because of her physical attractiveness. Now, I know in Egypt at 65, it states she was a very beautiful woman. But more than likely what's happening here, which would have been a common thing in the day, is Abimelech sees Abraham. He sees his wealth. He recognizes the reputation of this man. I mean, this is a man that defeated kings. So what do you want with that kind of person? You want an alliance. And so he hears that Sarah, apparently his sister, is unclaimed. So I'll take her. Now, I know some still want to say it was more sexual in nature, that he was wanting to have her in that way. And again, I've even heard one person say that God was revitalizing Sarah physically to prepare her to conceive the promised child. I don't know. What I know is Abimelech takes her. He claims her, places her more than likely in his harem to live with him. And what happens? God intervenes. Isn't that the testimony? the everlasting God acts. The everlasting God is faithful. Listen to how that's emphasized again in the passage that I read. Notice first, God preserves his promise. Verse 3 reads, "But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken, for she is a man's wife.'" If you looked at that in the Hebrew text, that phrase, "you are a dead man," it is weighty. God basically is announcing, Abimelech, you're dead. You're dead. Now, he obviously is alarmed, reacts, and he says, "Listen, I didn't touch her. I didn't touch her." But then God says in verse 6, "It was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her." Now step back from that and appreciate what God is saying. He's protecting Sarah. He's preserving the promise. He's not going to allow the actions of Abimelech to jeopardize what he intends to do through Sarah and Abraham. He deliberately intervenes. He prevents Abimelech, whatever desire he may have had, he prevented him from acting on it. He did not touch her. Some, as I was reading on this, commented on that, how God deliberately intervened, that there are these moments that we may never fully see or grasp where God restrains evil, he redirects paths, he closes doors, he interrupts plans, all in order to preserve what he's ultimately doing. As I state it that way, let me quickly concede it isn't always the case. He permits, because of the free will of man and the volitions of individuals, for events to play out oftentimes in ways that can be devastating, but not when it comes to God's ultimate purpose and plan. And here, God had determined that Sarah would give birth to this promised child so that ultimately the supreme promised child, the Messiah, would come forth. So God wasn't about to let this just happen by chance. He intervenes. He preserves the promise. But there's something more as you listen to this in terms of God's actions, and it's, to me, somewhat of a surprise. Abraham is described by God as a prophet and one who might intercede for Abimelech. Verse 7, "Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live." Well, you may not know, this is the first time the word prophet is used in the book of Genesis, which means the first time from our perspective in the Bible. First time. Now think about that. The first use of this word is not applied to Abraham when he is succeeding. The first use of this word is applied to Abraham when he is floundering in fear. But God calls him a prophet. What is a prophet? That person that would deliver God's message. Well, think that through. That means his role is tied more to the faithfulness of the everlasting God than the giftedness or the internal strength of the so-called individual. I'm just personally grateful that those that might serve God in whatever capacities he would call them to are able to do so because of who God is, not so much defined by who they perceive themselves to be or not to be. I mean, when you survey the Bible, how many times does God go out of the way to demonstrate his capacity to work through flawed individuals, or individuals that had chapters that they wish they could forget. Can I remind you of Moses trying to take charge of things, murdering a man? Need I remind you of notable King David that is described in Scripture as a man after God's own heart, and yet he finds himself involved in an illicit relationship? Why do I note that? I just want us to appreciate that when God addresses us, when God seeks to use us, at the end of the day, what should be recognized in that context is that it is the Lord that is the key to that. That the people themselves, by and large, are frail and sometimes struggle, as we see with Abraham. But stay with this. There's also an irony when you look at this passage as I've read it for us. And the irony, as I view it, is this: Abraham feared a man who ultimately feared God more than Abraham. When Abimelech hears what God says, he made an about face. He feared the Lord. He wasn't going to deal with that. Here's what I want you to think about. I think Abimelech feared God more than Abraham did in that moment. Abraham feared men more than he feared God. His focus was on men rather than on God. It is ironic if you think about it. Which brings us, I need to move us further along. Abimelech confronts Abraham, and he does so, I think, appropriately. Verse 9, then Abimelech called Abraham, said to him, "What have you done to us? How have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." True statement. True statement. Abimelech confronts him. One of the humbling things as you read through Scripture is that sometimes unbelievers behave more honorably than believers. That does appear to be the case with Abimelech. And then finally, Abimelech blesses Abraham. I say finally, there are two additional points. Abimelech could have just given him Sarah and sent him on his way, and that would have been enough. But that's not what he does. He blesses Abraham with significant wealth. What's up with that? I think his encounter with the everlasting God, speaking of Abimelech, made such an impression, he wanted to be on the side of the man that this God is protecting. So I'm going to bless him. And it takes you back to Genesis 12. God blesses those who bless Abraham. Well, Abimelech wants to be on the side of the God that blesses this man. And as that chapter concludes, Abraham then intercedes for Abimelech. Apparently, God had closed the wombs of all the women in his household. Abraham prays. God heals the situation. Before we move to the next main section, and boy, my time is running out, let me make one additional comment with regard to faith and fear. Fear is not something that you choose to feel. It's an emotional reaction. You find yourself in a circumstance that's greater than you, or a set of circumstances where there's some doubt about how it will play out, and inwardly you just begin to be afraid. It's an emotional reaction. Or it may even be you wondering about tomorrow and the uncertainty of that. It's just an emotional reaction. That's what fear is. It is not a sin to be afraid. It's human to be afraid. So where does faith come into this? Well, faith gives us the capacity to navigate the emotion. It's there to help us move through what we may be inwardly feeling so that we are not dominated by the fear, but rather guided by the God in whom we trust. and the promises that he provides. So when I'm afraid, what I want to do is acknowledge the emotion, but then refocus my attention on God. I'm grateful for David at that point. We've been reading through the Psalms currently in our daily reading, and not long ago we read Psalm 56. And let me remind you, when we think of David, what do we think of him? Boy, he was courageous. He faced off against Goliath. Well, read his Psalms. David was frequently afraid. But what did he do with this fear? Well, let me read Psalm 56:3. This is David. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. Hear that? It's personal. He's speaking to God. His focus is on God. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust. He recognized there are things that God has said, and so he's not just responding to God, he's responding to God's word. Then he says, I shall not be afraid. What can flesh do to me? You hear that? When your focus is properly directed toward God, he enables you to navigate the situation and to move beyond the fear. Now, I'm not going to lie, the fear may come back around. It frequently does. But we should know in that instance, what we do is just refocus on the God who is with us. We allow his word then to guide us. Well, let me move us rapidly on into our lesson as we move into chapter 21. And this won't take a great deal of time, but I want us to see it. In contrast to chapter 20, what does chapter 21 emphasize? Basically this: God fulfills his promise. 25 years earlier, God promised Abram at the time, you're going to have a child. Going to create a line of descendants that ultimately your seed's going to bless the nations of the world. Genesis 21, God fulfills it. Listen to it. I'll read verses 1 through 7. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time, notice that, at the time of which God had spoken to him, meaning he had announced it a year earlier, and it's happening. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And of course, as we previously noted, that name means laughter. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Let's appreciate he's doing what God asked at this point. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. 2 observations I would make. At the right time, in the right way, God keeps his promise. God said he was going to do this. He deliberately delayed it 25 years to demonstrate ultimately that the fulfillment of the promise rested upon the faithfulness of the everlasting God, not the capabilities of Abraham and Sarah. So Isaac was born at the right time, in the right way, because God kept his promise. And as Moses recorded this, he went out of the way to stress that. In the text, what does he say? As he said, as he promised, at the appointed time. What's being stated is this is about God's faithfulness. First and foremost, God does not forget his promises. But second, God would have the final laugh. If you have been with us, how many times has laughter been emphasized concerning the promise of this child being born? When God informed Abram, or later to be Abraham, about this, he laughed about it. Now, some thought it was a laugh of astonishment. I think it was still more of a laugh of skepticism. But he laughed. And then last week, as you saw in chapter 18, when God announces in a year's time, she's going to have this child, Sarah laughs. Not a laughter of joy, a laughter of doubt. But now, as chapter 21 depicts, Sarah's laughing. And she's laughing with joy. Her heart is full. The fulfillment of God's promise is not just causing her to laugh, it's causing people to laugh over her. It's brought gladness into their household. God would have the final laugh. Two other emphases I would stress before I'm done. Past failures still produce consequences. You'll see the reference in the notes. I'm not going to read it, don't have time for us to read it. But let me highlight what is described. Following the birth of Isaac, Abraham and Sarah, I guess at about age 2 or 3, host a celebration because he's going to be weaned off of nursing from Sarah. And they're throwing a party. And that results in conflict erupting in the household. And what was the cause of the conflict? Well, we're told in Genesis 21:9 that Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, of course we're talking about Ishmael. She saw him, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. Maybe we read that and we think, well, he's happy, right? Well, according to the Apostle Paul in Galatians 4, as he characterized the 13-year-old Ishmael's attitude and actions, it was not a laughter of joy, but of persecution. It's a laughter of scorn. So, now you have conflict in the household. Because Abraham and Sarah had approached a solution that was not God's plan for them in conceiving a child through Hagar, her servant. But now this 13-year-old son, technically speaking, Abraham's firstborn, is becoming a source of conflict within the home. And it was so disturbing to Sarah, she demands that Abraham send Ishmael and Hagar away. He didn't want to do it. He loved his son. But God speaks to Abraham and informs him, you do what Sarah asked. What's God doing? God recognizes that this level of discord or conflict would only worsen. So he sends Ishmael and Hagar away. Conflict erupts. Now, as you think about this, there's a point that stood out to me as we think about our own life experiences. God's patience and forgiveness do not always erase earthly consequences. God forgave Sarah and Abraham for what they did. He did. But because they put into motion the birth of this child and now are dealing with the dynamics of this, it was still a part of their lives. And I just say that to acknowledge there will be instances God absolutely has forgiven you. He's patient with you, but you may still have to contend on occasion with some of the fallout that's associated with the choices that you made. Abraham certainly had to do that. And then painfully, he had to send his son away. But even here, as I state in the handout, God's grace appears. God reassures Abraham, I'm going to take care of Ishmael. Don't you be afraid of that. And then as Ishmael and Hagar find themselves in the wilderness panicking that they're going to perish, God hears and speaks to Ishmael and reassures him. God extends mercy and grace even in the midst of the dysfunction of what had been. I think we should note that. Which brings us to the ending of chapter 21, and I have all of 5 minutes to take us there. How does the chapter close? The reference verses are there, 22 through 34. What we have depicted is a treaty is established with Abimelech and Abraham in Beersheba. Some scholars debate, is this the same Abimelech? Personally, I'm convinced it is. That there's, in chapter 21 and 20 and 21, kind of a unit whole that is playing out. So we start with Abimelech, and now we're ending chapter 21 with Abimelech. But now this time, the very man that claimed Sarah as his own, but then recognized the authority of the everlasting God, observes the continuing blessing of God on Abraham. And yeah, there develop some issues concerning some of the wells, and what emerges from that is a treaty between Abraham and Abimelech. Abimelech wants to be as close to Abraham as he can possibly be because he wants the favor and blessing of Abraham's God. So they form this treaty, and that's what's described. And then following that, Abraham, as I read at the very start of tonight's lesson, plants a tamarisk tree, calls on the Lord, the everlasting God. Why? When you start in chapter 20 and now end up at the conclusion of this part of the journey in chapter 21, it gives us insight now into what Abraham had come to understand. He plants a tree. He calls on the Lord. Now, the tamarisk tree, as you look at just a little bit of the background of that tree, is a slow-growing tree. It's a long-lasting tree. It's a tree that over a great length of time would continue to be a witness to the testimony that Abraham had come to know. And what was that testimony? That the everlasting God is faithful. He was faithful in the past, faithful in the present, and based now on his growing understanding, will be faithful in the future. And get ready, we're going to see that play out when we move into chapter 22. He plants this tree to celebrate God's provision as he calls upon the Lord. To me, that's instructive. It's telling as we have reflected on Abraham's journey. And our response to all of this, well, in your handout, I would be remiss if I don't direct us to do something based on what we've considered. First, if I may, do not allow fear to become your guide. Fear will visit every single one of our lives, but fear is a poor compass. It will always point you in the wrong direction. So when fear appears, what do? You refocus your heart on the God who is with you. You redirect your attention to the promises of his word. And then you navigate the emotion. Do not allow fear to become your guide. Second, trust God's faithfulness more than your consistency. Think on that. Sometimes I think we're convinced that Our success and future success in the causes of God rest entirely on us. Through the example of Abraham, I think we should acknowledge that what needs to happen and ultimately will happen rests more on the faithfulness of God than the dependability of you. I want to be as faithful and dependable and available as I can possibly be. But even as I would express that, I readily confess I will only accomplish what needs to be because God is faithful. It's the faithfulness of God. Third, wait patiently upon God's timing. I mean, we've looked at this repeatedly, over and over again. God kept promising, Abraham kept pressing. And yet, in chapter 1, we see God fulfills the promise, which further reminds us we just need to rest in His timing. Stop dictating to God and begin to trust Him. I mean, what if in some cases, as God's trying to move you forward, it actually requires years? Will you wait? Will you trust? Based on Abraham's example, I would strongly urge us to wait patiently. And then finally, and I close, do something tangible that reminds you of God's presence and faithfulness. Abraham planted a tree, calls on the Lord, speaks of God in a fresh way. He did something tangible. What if we should do the same? Now, again, you might want to plant a tree. I'm not even talking you off of that. But there are simpler things that you might do. What if you begin to journal and acknowledge God's faithfulness in recognizable ways so that you can look back over time and be reminded of what He did? Or what if you just took some index cards and begin to write out the promises of God and just begin to place them in strategic places around the house to serve as a visual reminder of the God who is faithful? You say, well, I don't think that fits my decorations. Well, then go and find you a verse or a promise that's beautifully framed and hang it strategically in your home so that you see something that reminds you of the faithfulness of God. Or why don't you gather around you people and just begin to share about the faithfulness of God and develop a level of accountability that reminds each of you to talk about the God that is faithful. At the end of the day, as I look at Abraham's actions in planting the tree, it just suggests it may be good to do something tangible, something physical that serves to remind you that the God you trust, the everlasting God, is faithful. Do something, even tomorrow, that acknowledges that. Next week, we move into chapter 22, and we're going to slow it down. We're just going to do one chapter, because it may be, in the life of this man of faith, the most defining moment in Abraham's life. So read ahead. Prepare yourself for it, because what we will look at next week will even open our eyes to something that God will. So come back next week. We'll consider what that is. Let me pray for us. Father, I'm grateful for the attentiveness of these here, for those that have joined us online. And I pray as we've moved through these two chapters that you've emphasized some things within our hearts that we needed to consider. There may be somebody watching right now where fear is that dominating guide that's leading them to make choices and decisions that they should not be making. May they learn from Abraham. May they renew their focus on you, their trust in you. Father, maybe many here just need to, in fresh ways, acknowledge you are faithful. You are faithful. You are faithful. Forgive us when we allow the circumstances of life to somehow distract us from that realization. You are the everlasting God who is faithful. For that we give thanks. Bless us as we go our different ways this evening. We ask in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.